Turkish lira has lost over 40% value this year amid Turkey-US tensions. Instead of compromising, Turkey declared on Wednesday that the government had raised tariffs on US imports, including cars, tobacco and alcohol. What's behind the Turkish fiscal crisis? What steps will Erdogan take to tackle it? Qatar supported Ankara by putting $15 billion into Turkish banks and the financial market, together with purchasing millions of Turkish lira in the name of standing by its brothers in Turkey. Why is Doha forming a joint front with Turkey, and what does the Turkish-Qatari connection mean for the region? With many EU banks holding Turkish debt, the collapse of the lira could lead to a domino effect in EU banking and finance. What's the risk that the EU will be hurt further by the crisis Turkey is undergoing? The Indian rupee, the Russian ruble, and other countries' stock markets also suffered losses. What will these countries need to do to recover from losses related to the Turkish crisis?
The U.S. on Wednesday ruled out removing steel tariffs that have contributed to a currency crisis in Turkey, as Qatar pledged $15 billion in investment to Turkey, supporting a rise in the Turkish lira. Now, Turkey's currency depreciation has been blamed for pulling down the Russian ruble, but what about the South African rand and Indian rupee also being devalued? Are those moves related? What are the repercussions for emerging markets? And what's next for a beleaguered Turkish lira? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Harvey Zoden, a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Mr. Atu Anija, an associate editor with The Hindu, and via satellite by Mr. Hong Hao, who is the head of research and chief strategist at the Bank of Communications International in Hong Kong. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Li Qiuyuan. So let's talk about this. Mr. Zoden first, how did this all begin?
It's a long story, but the most immediate part of the story is that President Trump put tariffs on Turkish aluminum and steel because he believes that the Turkish government is unfairly and unjustly holding an American minister who's been in jail in Turkey for 2 years. It seemed like there might have been a deal a few weeks ago, but this deal fell apart. So Trump got tough, and because Trump imposed these tariffs on Turkey, it must have been the straw that broke the camel's back, because starting with that, the lira took a deep plunge.
Yeah, that's right. And now Qatar is standing by Turkey with a $15 billion investment into Turkish financial markets and banks. As I mentioned a little earlier, the Qatari emir actually said that Qatari people have purchased millions of Turkish lira to support Ankara. So, Mr. Anija, some are calling this Turkish-Qatari alliance the third axis in the Middle East. What do you think of this concept? What does this mean for the region?
Well, Qatar is a very interesting country. You know, it has over time, actually historically, a problem with Saudi Arabia. But during the 2011-12, the Arab Spring, it was actually the fault lines were not so sharpened. But later on, there was a change of leadership in Qatar, and you found a very clear-cut swing of the Qatari Amir towards the other side, which is towards Iran side, and then even towards Hezbollah and others in Lebanon. So there's a very, and most prominently, I was in Qatar about last year, in fact, and one could see the flow of Turkish goods which were coming in. Turks had also established a base, military base at the borders of Qatar. So there was a clear-cut shift, but that was again feeding it because of the Iran-Turkish axis, if you like, and the Qataris joining that in, and the Saudis on the other side. So that's where you find it, because Qatar being such a small country, it was really Turkey which was a security anchor for Qatar, and it's payback time now for Qatar to support Turkey at the time of its economic woes.
Yeah, let me bring in Mr. Hong joining us from Hong Kong. I mean, you're based in Hong Kong. How do you see the turn of events at this moment? I heard Hong Kong Stock Exchange is also being affected by this.
Yes, the Hong Kong market tends to be very susceptible to foreign volatilities. Basically, on one hand, we have the domestic Asia market, which is under some pressure. recently. And then on the other hand, because of the attack on the Hong Kong currency, which has weakened substantially. So I think the HKMA had to intervene in the open market. So that actually drained some of the liquidity from the system. And also because of the contagion effect from other emerging markets, and also, to a certain extent from Europe, the Hong Kong market has been under quite a bit of pressure. It's down, since the highest point in January, it's down more than 6,000 points now. So it's one of the worst performing stock market index here in this region. One
of the worst performing. And Mr. Hong, do you think we're seeing a currency war emerging?
Yeah, well, we can't rule out that possibility because, so far this year we're seeing emerging market currencies all have weakened substantially against the US dollars. Even though recently the Chinese yuan has been under some pressure, but relative to the other emerging market currencies, the yuan is actually outperforming. It's actually one of the better performing emerging market currencies relative to the others. I think Hong Kong dollar in recent days has been under substantial pressure as well, and that is the reason why I just now I mentioned that the HKMA has to intervene in the open market. So last night, in recent days actually, HKMA intervened in the open market for several times and drained down liquidity in the market and to support the Hong Kong dollar. So I would say that at this sensitive time, any further and substantial weakening of a currency could be misconstrued as a currency war, as the monetary authority deliberately weaken the currency substantially to transfer the cost of economic restructuring to overseas markets. So, we can't rule out the possibility that, the substantial weakening in the currencies in this region could be misconstrued by the observers in other regions.
Let me get your thoughts on this, Mr. Zoden. The Turkish president also claims that U.S. is launching a cursing attack on lira. Is there any evidence for this economic operation regarding Turkey?
I sometimes feel that the Turkish president and President Trump both graduated from Trump University because they have bizarre theories. President Trump thinks that any trade deficit is bad. President Erdogan feels that interest rates are bad and un-Islamic. There is perhaps one unintended consequence that has been caused by America, and that is America, to control its own economy and its own inflation, has been gradually, the Federal Reserve has been gradually raising interest rates. So to that extent, investors are moving more and more to the rising dollar, because not only is it relatively safe, it's relatively good return on investment.
And your thoughts on this?
Well, I partially agree with what Harvey is saying. But I do think there is a little bit of a broader geopolitical game going as well, which is also feeding into the economic logic of it, which you very rightly mentioned. And I do think if you take a country like Turkey, such a pivotal state at the doorstep of Europe, and where it swings will actually affect the Eurasian politics big time. And the closeness of Turks with both Iran, whom is in the crosshairs of Trump, and the Israelis, and with the Russians as well. In fact, Lavrov was there yesterday, or day before yesterday, and they talk about a bilateral currency swaps, that is Turkish goods to be sold in rubles to Russia, and the other way around. So there are wheels within wheels here, but I think if you take it the big picture, a little bit of geopolitics is feeding into this animosity between Trump. What I'm trying to say is that there are several layers to this animosity, and geopolitics
I don't
is one
disagree with that.
Yeah. Now, Erdogan seems to be politicizing this financial instability by, also saying not to buy iPhones, for example. He's trying to shift focus away from mismanagement. But do you think that politicizing the fiscal problem, he will create a really schism between U.S. and Turkey?
When you look at the economic size of the U.S., there's no competition here. I don't think Turkey really has the tools to sort of counter this behemoth U.S. economy. So, boycott, symbolically it might be okay, and especially for a domestic audience, is to shore up his popularity. But I don't think that's going to change the big picture. I think U.S. is just too dominant, has too many tools when you take an emerging economy like Turkey.
Do you agree? The Turkey doesn't have much leverage here.
It doesn't have much leverage. Its economy is only 1% of the world's economy. Also, I believe this is not about economics. So you talked about geopolitics. I'm going to talk about bilateral politics. So President Erdogan at one time had a strong ally in Fethullah Gulen, who's now his enemy and who he's calling a terrorist. President Erdogan would very much like to have Gulen back. I think most of this conflict is about that. They're both positioning each other to try to get Gulen back, and the minister who's been held for 2 years is just a pawn.
Now, Turkey also think that, the country is invaluable to the U.S. and NATO. They're not expendable. But President Trump doesn't seem to care much about it, doesn't care about the retention of Turkey and NATO, or letting it run to Russia. Why is that?
Well, I don't think President Trump thinks about NATO too much for a start. But also, I think America is angry with Turkey. Angry because Turkey's not a reliable ally. Angry because Turkey has made a move to buy Russian equipment, and that's upset not only America but also NATO. Turkey also plays ball with Russia, and I think the big problem is today that Turkey will be playing America off against Russia, and I think that this is very serious for the future. However, I don't think Turkey wants to leave NATO, at least not at this time. Why? 2 reasons. Number one, Turkey depends on NATO for air cover. It's clear that they don't have enough air cover support. And number 2, they rely especially on America for intelligence. Until those 2 issues are addressed, I don't think Turkey's going anywhere.
What about you? Your thoughts on this?
It's early days, but right now I agree with Harvey that the dependence on security is too much on the NATO and the US. But suppose this were to continue. If Gulen is not delivered and the pastor is not returned to the US, then where does it go? I think there's a deeper processes which are taking place between Turkey and the Russians and the Iranians. So Turkey alone may not be able to counter the US, but if there are several trip lines here. But as we progress, if you look one scenario, if this confrontation continues, then I think Turkey might consider integration more deeply, even in security terms. Harvey mentioned about the equipment over here, but the deeper things like intelligence sharing, etc. Those structurally, if Turkey moves from the Western camp and the NATO camp and incrementally goes towards, let's say, the SCO fold, then there is a structural shift. It's a post-war structural shift. I do not think, given Turkey's geographical position, and this is right from the time when Truman really, it's a Truman doctrine, which identified Turkey as a linchpin, pivotal state towards the then Soviet Union. So I think there will be a lot of inner movement within the United States as well, and there will be pressures, whether Trump agrees to those pressures or not, but there will be a movement from the realist school, ex-post Brzezinski. Now Brzezinski is no more, but Scowcroft and Kissinger and others who would talk for a greater restraint from within America, not to push Turkey so hard that it makes this structural breach towards Eurasia and closer towards, you see the Iran is already observer in the SCO, and Turks are knocking on the door. They also want to get into this. So there is some pathway which is there for the Turks, though there will be a big cost to pay if it has to move in that direction. So I think there will be pressures from both sides, within Turkey and within the United States, not to let this precipitate beyond a certain point.
And one asset that we didn't talk about was that the Turks have this important Air Force base called Incirlik. We use that. We use it very much in the conflicts that have been happening the last decade or so. It's invaluable for us. So this is another balancing point.
All right, let's now take a short break on Dialogue. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Dialogue. Let me get to you, Mr. Hong, joining us from Hong Kong now. Analysts agree that an easy fix for Turkey would be to raise the country's interest rate by as much as 10%, encouraging investors to, put more money in Turkish banks. This is unlikely to happen, although, given that Erdogan has called interest rates evil. How counterproductive is this in helping Turkey's economy? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it is now between a rock and a hard place, really, because if you raise interest rate, it will cause substantial pain for the financial market in the near term. And I think the Turks can also go to IMF asking for help, but then IMF is led by the U.S., and then you have to agree to some of very harsh terms dictated by the IMF. So I think in the near term there isn't that much of a choice here. And also just now I heard two of your guests debating what other choices is for Erdogan. Mm-hmm. Now the thing is that we have to remember he actually succumbed to pressure in two previous incidents. For example, I remember back then there was a German journalist was detained by Turkish policemen, and I think Angela Merkel was very angry about it, and I think she put pressure on Erdogan, and then and got the journalist released. And also in 2015, one of the Russian plane was shut down by Turkish army. I think Putin put on pressure as well, and I think that makes Erdogan agree to some of the Russian terms as well. So don't forget some good precedents that is showing us that there could be breakthroughs somewhere down the road. So I think at this point in time, even though the market is very volatile, the market participants here are not treating sort of a further aggravation or confrontation between the U.S. and the Turks as a base case for pricing the assets here. And that is the reason why, even though in the past 2 days the sell-off pressure has been quite substantial, both in domestic Asian market and also in Hong Kong, and today we're seeing the market is actually recovering some of the losses during the day.
And how do you think the EU is exposed to Turkish financial crisis, Mr. Hong?
Yeah, I think mostly through lending. Basically, some European banks lend about $200 billion worth of loans to Turkey. So I think some of the loans, if the crisis worsen from here, some of the loans could turn bad. And I think some of the European banks, such as the BNP, has quite a bit of exposure to Turkish loans. And I think if all of those loans goes bad, then it could end up wiping out the bank's equity. So I think if that happened, it could be a very precarious situation. And also with the geographical proximity and also with economic cooperation, and also many of the European companies have economic interest in Turkey as well. So I think through various channels the EU could get affected if the crisis wasn't from here.
Yeah, there are real concerns about these European banks suffer losses on loans in Turkey. Also, Europe still depends on Turkey to restrain the flow of migrants from conflicts in the Middle East. I mean, any resumption of flow of migrants would be a political issue in Europe. Some say that this could hurt Europe much more than the U.S. So they're saying maybe perhaps this is connected to President Trump's hardline policy on the EU. Is this mere speculation, or there's any substance to this thinking?
I don't think President Trump thinks so strategically. So there may be a connection, but I'm not sure that it's coming from him. Again, I think it goes back to Gulen. I also think, however, that the opposite might be true, that this may be a good opportunity for Turkey to improve its relationship with Europe, which is not a good one. And I thought it was interesting that within the last 24 hours, Angela Merkel called President Erdogan and offered his support. So it may be a catalyst for good in the end, actually.
What's the way out now for Turkey? Will Turkey go back to the IMF? I mean, what's a good managed way out for this?
Well, I think what Trump would do, as in the case with Iran, when the Americans walked out of the Iran nuclear deal, was try a grand bargain in the end, because Trump has hinted at talking with the Iranians again, but with A, B, C to be done, that is delinking from Hezbollah and several other very major steps the Iranians have to do if they want to be reaccommodated. I think the similar formula will come with Turkey. That if you, it has to go beyond just the economics of it. If the Iranian president is to be seen, which would mean, first thing, the relationship between the Turks and Saudi Arabia, which is so bad right now, that somewhere the Turks have to move on that front as well. Turkey-Iran relations, you mentioned about the Qataris, so there would be pressure on the Turks to move on all these axes if you want to get reaccommodated. I mean, that I think could be one way of looking at it, that it will be just not currency and economics, but a much larger package may come from the American side to normalize. But having said so, again, there are counter-bargaining chips which Turks have, which the Iranians probably didn't have. So, you know, there may be something in the middle which may come.
I think that the burden onus is on Turkey to try to make some offer or to extend an olive branch to America. Obviously, the Qatari offer today of $15 billion is important and has stopped the drop. But Turkey's foreign debt is much more than that. Some estimates as high as $500 billion and estimates as high as 57% of GDP. So I don't think that Turkey is in any position to dictate. Yes, they have some strategic advantages, but I think they're going to have to find a way to extend an olive branch to America to start to resolve this very serious problem.
Let's now also talk about the spillover effects. I mean, trouble in Turkey could make investors reassess their holdings in other emerging markets, and we're already looking at Indian rupees going down. In August alone, a loss about 5%, which is quite deep. It crossed the psychological mark, 70 mark against $1 US for the very first time. I mean, should we worry about it?
Well, I think the general sentiment against the emerging markets, you have a Turkish sort of spillover on that. But as far as the Indian rupee is concerned, there are other factors, not just the Turkish angle, which is responsible. First of all, the drop is not that steep. You can see it 5% now, but overall in the year it's an 8% drop, which is okay. And from 67, 68, it's gone down to 70. It's hovering around that. The bigger problem is the trade imbalance which is coming in India, which is because of the rising oil prices. The oil bill has just shot up, and the adverse trade balance is now $16 billion, which has come because of that. So that's one very major factor which is coming. But you know, the exporters though are feeling okay that if there's a drop in the Indian rupee, then Indian exports could go high because they're cheaper, etc. Though if the drop continues to be too steep, then investments which are coming from the Indian stock market may get reduced, because and then if a foreign investor puts money in an Indian equity fund, then ultimately the gains will depend on the value of the rupee. If it's too low, then you don't earn the dollars which you make on that investment. So investment becomes an issue if it drops too slow. But finally, if you look at India's external reserves, they are about $400 billion. So the Reserve Bank of India has so far used only $24 billion to shore up the value of the rupee in the entire year. So there are enough money in the kitty that if the rupee were to fall beyond a certain point, I think the Reserve Bank of India will intervene in the markets, buy the rupees, increase the demand for the rupee, and shore up its value. So I don't think in the Indian case, given the overall fundamentals, it's that big a problem right now.
Mr. Home, what are your thoughts on this? Not so much a big problem for India, given the devaluation we're seeing in rupees.
the Indian fundamentals are relatively strong, and also, just now your guest mentioned that, there is indeed quite a bit of foreign currency reserve in the central bank's coffer. So I would say for now, it is not big of a concern. But the problem, or the past experiences have been that, once the contagion happened, for example, back in 2010, there was a Greek debt crisis, and there was a relatively small economy in Europe, and that created a huge contagion effect across EU. And also back in 1998, it started from Thailand. Thailand is, even though back then was growing very rapidly, but in terms of overall size, it's still a very small economy in the overall scheme of things. But it rapidly worsened into a major regional crisis. So I would say that for now, even though emerging market as a whole is in a better situation than before, but I think when the financial contagion happened, people would, hedge funds or some speculator would start not only shorting the currencies but also other financial assets as well, and that would create a huge correlation across different asset classes, and eventually it will blow up someone's balance sheet. And I think those are, even though at this point in time the risk is not that big, but given the past experience, we still have to be watching out for those latent risks.
Yeah. And Mr. Zodan, are we going to see a contagion effect maybe in emerging markets, because we're already seeing stock exchange of Thailand suffered, India, Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Shanghai exchanges all suffered. What do you think?
Well, I think that President Trump has started a lot of wars, whether they're economic or otherwise, in the last few months. And this is just another one. He doesn't realize that they're all interrelated in some way. Yes, based on the past experience, I think that there will be a continuation of contagion. I think the drop in the Turkish lira, for example, it's a pause and not a drop. And contrary to the philosophy of only America first, I think it's an opportunity to do what President Xi Jinping has been talking about, and that is to get the multilateral, multinational organizations involved so you can have an international settlement, or at least a discussion, and not let this continue to a point where it gets to be a big danger for the whole world.
Yeah, the currency devaluation is now worst at 34% in Pakistan, 8% in Azerbaijan, 6% in Kazakhstan, 6% in Fiji, and 4% in Bangladesh as of May. Is this a warning of some kind of larger, the sign of something larger on the horizon? What do you think?
I think the world needs a structural change, frankly, in terms of finances, in terms of markets, in terms of geographies. I think this post-war World War world, which is so dependent on the West for its markets and for finances, needs to now relook at probably at Asia and drawing its own supply chains within. So if you see the rise of the East, in the sense the rise of China, India, and further down towards Europe, I think that these should be the new anchors, new growth engines, which countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh or even India need to sort of realign and look, and so that it's more balanced, that we are not over dependent on the West. I'm not saying that there's a gang up against the West. That again is not workable, because we really need something which is good for both, but we do need a better balance, structural balance in terms of economy, for a lasting change, that we are not prone to these kind of disruptions as we are now. All
right, let's leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Nija and Mr. Zodan joining me in the Beijing studio, and Mr. Hong joining us via satellite from Hong Kong. That's going to do it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.